Hello, this is episode number 15 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, martial arts journalist, former contributing editor to Black Belt Magazine, and the author of the book, The Principles of Unarmed Combat. I tell stories about martial arts. So when you look at the world of mixed martial arts, the one style that seems to be really dominating the sport right now is the Russian-based grappling style of Sambo. It's produced outstanding fighters like Islam Makhachev and Merab Dvalishvili, and our guest today is here to explain why Sambo is finding so much success. Known as Sambo Steve, Stephen Koepfer has, to a large extent, been the face of American Sambo for the past 20 years. He's competed, coached, and especially promoted the sport unlike any other American during that time. Steve, how are you?
Hey, what's up, Mark? How are you, man? Thanks for having
Good,
me on.
good. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, no
Uh,
problem.
to start out, can you tell a little bit about yourself, how you got interested in martial arts, what styles you originally trained in?
Sure. I am a product. I guess the seed was planted by karate daycare when I was 6 or 7. I was a latchkey kid. I had two
Yeah.
working parents. My mom was a professor at Queens College,
Mhm.
evolutionary biology. So the college had, they had activities to put your kids in while the parents were working, and so I took Shotokan karate, which honestly, I don't even consider myself having a background in Shotokan, but I did it for a couple of years as a kid, and it
Mhm.
and it got me interested in martial arts. Then I came back to martial arts towards the end of high school with Taekwondo and in the 80s, like everybody.
Right.
And then it was an interesting time for Taekwondo because I began it pre-Olympic Taekwondo and
Mhm.
left it post-Olympic Taekwondo, so I was kind of there for that transitional time.
Yeah.
And then from there, I left Taekwondo in about 95, I think. And then I went to Sanshou and sort of rudimentary grappling that was
Mhm.
going on, mid 90s grappling.
Right.
And then by 99, I found my Sambo coach, and the rest is history, man.
Yeah, I guess Sambo wasn't a real popular style in the US back then. I guess it still isn't that popular, but you ended up just kind of training in it by chance. You wandered into the Fight House gym one day and saw the Sambo class.
But yeah, pretty close to that. I mean,
Yeah.
I was looking to leave where I was training at the time, and I knew what Sambo was just basically because of like Oleg Taktarov,
Right.
And then for those listening, for the younger people, like that's the original UFC, Oleg Taktarov.
Yeah, he was
And
the UFC champion back in, I think, UFC 5 or 6.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And he made the rolling knee bar famous and all that
Yeah.
stuff. And then so I knew what it was, but it wasn't ubiquitous. I mean, actually BJJ wasn't really that ubiquitous back then either, but
Hmm.
it was more accessible than Sambo for sure.
Hmm.
At that time, there was a Sambo, infrastructure here in the United States, but it was largely connected to the wrestling community because FILA, as I'm sure you know, FILA was the first world body to govern Sambo. So
Right.
from 73 to 86, you had FILA governing freestyle, Greco, and Sambo. And then in 86, FIAS was founded and they went their own way. But so there was a large connection. Like if you were a wrestler, you knew what Sambo was, but
Yeah.
the sort of rank and file grapplers didn't.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of a product of the expat. Like there were sort of two types of Sambo coaches. There were the kind that were sort of pre-fall of the Soviet Union that
Hmm.
learned it through wrestling.
Right.
And then, sort of post-fall of the Soviet Union or refuseniks or people who could get to the States, Soviet trained coaches
Yeah.
that could get here. So I'm
Yeah.
sort of trained in that camp, but of course got to know a lot of wrestlers and stuff too because we all
Right.
commingled. But
For people who aren't that familiar with Sambo, can you give a little background on it? I know it comes out of judo and like you said,
Hmm.
was founded in the old evil empire, this old Soviet Union. Uh, what?
Sure. Well, Sambo was like most martial arts, and probably like all martial arts, was originally designed for non-sport purposes. There's combat Sambo, what people call now combat Sambo. Um, in the early days, it was still just called Sambo, right?
Mhm.
And then it was designed to be a hand-to-hand fighting system. And then, also like most combat systems, people realized, well, if we really do this the way that it's intended, we're not going to have anybody to train with. So we have to come up with some parameters so we can train without killing each other and stuff. And then, eventually a sport version is born. And that was in 1938. Official is like the quote unquote official birth date
Yeah,
of
I think it
sport sambo.
started with the old Soviet, the KGB or their forerunner. I forget what it was called, the old Soviet secret police. I think they were the some of the early proponents of Sambo, weren't they?
Yeah, yeah, they were. And contrary to the acronym, which means self-defense without weapons, I mean, they were training with weapons.
Yeah.
But the sport version obviously had no weapons, and at that time it was just a grappling sport. And
Mhm.
then, believe it or not, it was something that surprises a lot of people is that the formalization of combat sambo as a sport did not happen until 2001, right? So
Yeah.
that was people think, I mean, it is the original style, as it
Mhm.
were, and then came sports sambo. So what's interesting is like I got started in sambo before there was ever a combat sambo world championships, right?
Mhm.
So, and you remember, I'm sure, at that time you would look up combat sambo and you would find videos of guys in camouflage fighting with bayonets and knives and guns
Yeah,
and stuff like
I know. I trained a few times with David Rudman, who people might not know is it was one of the all-time great Sambo guys from the
that.
Soviet
Hmm.
Union. And he told
Rest in
me
peace.
when he
Yeah,
was doing it back in the 60s that he would train with the military and KGB guys, and they would do what became combat Sambo, but he's, the only competition was just strict grappling back then.
exactly, exactly. So I think like many things of the zeitgeist of that sort of mid 90s with mixed martial arts, UFC, Shudo, stuff like that, sort of mixed style competitions started becoming popular again, and along came a sport version of combat sambo. So
Yeah.
I think it's directly related to mixed martial arts, the fact that there is even
Yeah,
a sort of
surely.
world version of combat sambo. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny how the UFC affected so many arts, even ones that don't want to admit they were affected by it. But I think you see it in a lot of different military arts around the world.
Yep.
Everybody took note of that and changed, whether they want to admit it or not.
I mean, for sure, it existed as a style. People were sparring in military clubs and fighting
Yeah,
each other and doing things like that, but it
yeah,
wasn't the formalized sport that we
yeah,
see
yeah.
now. I mean, just like Sanda, right? Sanda existed long before there was a
Right.
Sanda World Championships, but
And you kind of became the unofficial spokesman, sort of the face of American Sambo. I know in the early days of martial arts web forums, you were well known by your alias Sambo Steve for posting on the old underground forum touting Sambo, and most
yep.
other people were riding the BJJ wave. How hard was it to promote Sambo back then?
Well, it wasn't that hard. And by the way, that's the underground is where I got the Sambo Steve moniker. That's exactly where it was born. Our mutual friend Bruce Kivo, I remember I was trying to figure out what I should call myself when I was creating my account, and he was like, "Just call yourself Sambo Steve." We can thank Bruce for that. It's stuck for all these years. But
That was a great source of information back in the day. So many guys who are now really successful, well-known people within the martial arts industry were just they were great martial arts, but nobody heard of them back then,
mhm.
and they became known from posting on there. And handful of people like Craig Douglas, Phil Dunlap, guys that I know, I'm sure you know, they developed into very widely respected martial artists back then, but nobody knew who they were because they'd never been in the magazines, which were the only way anybody got known back then.
Yeah, yeah. It was dude, it was a fun time, you know. I mean, the
Yeah.
sport was being born along with the internet, you
Yeah.
know. It
Yeah.
was like sort of this commensurate path that they were
Hmm.
the two operations were taking. So it
Yeah.
was a cool the underground was great. I mean, for in the early days, I mean, you could it's kind of like how people view Twitter now. Like, oh, Twitter was so great. You could actually talk to real people and you know, and the underground was the same. You could talk to real fighters, you could talk to real people. I still have friends that I met on the underground that
Right.
were very close today, you know.
Yeah. And it's
But yeah.
interesting because you could tell certain people on there, you could read their posts and say, this guy really knows what he's talking about. Most people were full of hot air, but you'd find some people on there and you'd say, yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about. People should listen to this guy.
Yeah, yeah. It was cool. And they
Yeah.
had it was really cool. I mean, that's where we would mail VHS tapes to each other.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
all that crazy stuff, you know. It
Uh,
was, yeah, definitely a cool time,
yeah.
man. But to your original question, it wasn't difficult, I think, because I mean, part of it is I'll just be honest. Part of it wasn't that I was such a great Sambo coach in the early days or
Hmm.
anything. It was legit. I was the guy that was just waving the flag. I mean, there were people doing Sambo in this country long before me,
Hmm.
but they weren't as involved in the new technology. They, you know, like when I set up my YouTube channel in 2005, it was the first
Yeah.
Sambo channel, you
Yeah.
know. So I was just kind of it was coincidental, you know. I mean, I was good. I'm not world class.
Hmm.
I was a good
Well, you
grappler, and
did compete and coach at a high level, weren't you? Coach for the American team at the World Championships one year?
I did. That was in
Yeah.
2008. I
Yeah.
mean, and then yeah, I mean, I've coached on a high level internationally, not just Sambo, but also combat wrestling. I've coached in
Right.
Japan and like lots
Right.
of countries.
And
But
MMA too, don't you? You've had some guys
sure.
that did
Oh
MMA.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
totally. You know,
And
I've
you
coached
still
a
have
lot
your
in
school,
MMA.
you still have your school, New York Combat Sambo?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
April will be 24 years.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a long time for any school nowadays.
Yeah, it is, and we survived all
Yeah.
the craziness. But anyway, yeah, it wasn't hard, you know, like it was on some levels it was hard because the small Sambo community that existed didn't accept me right away.
Hmm.
You know, you know, there's politics like there's like in every martial art.
Yeah.
So like within the Sambo community, there were definitely some rough times.
Hmm.
But within the grappling and martial arts community at large, it wasn't difficult at all. People
Yeah.
were craving information, so it wasn't really hard. And I kind of just said, "Well, I'm the guy."
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then you kind of have to live up to that. You know, it's either
Yeah.
sink or swim at that
Yeah.
point. You know, so yeah. So fortunately, I didn't sink.
Well, it helped you add some credentials. You trained over in Russia a little bit over the years, didn't you?
Oh yeah, I've been there. I've been there 5 times. Yeah.
What was the training like over there?
It was great. It's interesting. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about originally, you know, the formation of Sambo. But over there, you know, like if I have Muay Thai friends, I'll tell them it's kind of like when people go to Thailand, you know, and
Hmm.
they're surprised how these big badass fighters they know how to spar lightly, you know, and
Hmm.
they know how to be technical,
Hmm.
and you know, because they're making a living at it,
Yeah.
you know. But it's the same over there. Like for the most, it's probably different now. Like the last time I was there was 2013. So,
Hmm.
but for a large percentage of, I think, Sambo history over there, if you were not a professional athlete, you weren't going to really be doing it. It wasn't like there was like recreational Sambo clubs on every corner or anything like
Hmm.
that. You know, it's a state-funded sports program, so you
Right.
had to be involved in that. And so the whole formality that people expect when you have, you know, like when you're here with the honorifics and the titles and all that grand poobah bullshit.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't exist over there. It's just like more like a wrestling club,
Yeah, my
you know.
impression is it's kind of like wrestling or football here in the US that a lot of kids do it in school, but
Hmm.
only the talented ones get a chance to go on to it when they're college age or adults.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's because it's state funded that you really do they spend a lot of time figuring out who those people are. So, I remember the first time I went to Sambo 70, which is a big club in
Yeah, yeah.
Moscow.
That's like the
Um,
Kodokan is in judo, Sambo 70 is for Sambo for anybody that doesn't
yeah,
realize that. Yeah.
it's one of them. It's one of them for sure.
Yeah.
There are a couple of big ones, but that one for the listeners is called Sambo 70 because it was founded in
Right.
1970 by David Rudman, who you
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah.
earlier. And it's massive. The facilities are absolutely massive. And
Mhm.
the first time I was there was in 2007, and it was already massive, but it was also like sort of that old school, like people will recognize it from movies, like people here in America, other places recognize it from movies, like that old school Soviet sort of architectural look, and
Very,
then,
very grim and gray.
well, actually, there's a lot of color. Like people don't
Was it?
realize, yeah, there was a lot of color, but it was kind of like, it was like public school paint color.
Yeah.
Like it was yellow, but it was kind of a drab yellow. There was pink there, but it's kind of a drab pink. I forget when it was, like 2010 or 11, or there was a big fire there, and
Mhm.
they rebuilt it. And then so, but the last time I was there in 2013, the new facility was insane. It was like Olympic training center level
Mhm.
stuff with a huge stadium and dormitories for dignitaries that overlook the stadium, and they just new pools, new workout
Mhm.
facilities, new everything,
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing, which kind of, if we, it'll bring us back to the combat sambo topic, which is the first time I was there in '07. I was there, I was in Russia in '07, '08, '09, 2011. I was in Ukraine, but with the same training, with the same coaches,
Hmm.
actually in Alushta in Crimea, which is now annexed by
Right.
Russia, but it wasn't when I was there. And then in 2013, back in Moscow. So when I was there in 2007, there was at Sambo 70, it was just Sambo and judo,
Hmm.
sports Sambo, judo, nothing
Right.
else, right? And then by 2013, they had instituted combat Sambo in there as a field of study, let's say. And when people listening to this have to understand that this is where kids go to grammar school, middle school, high school, and after classes, they're training. Like this is all they do. So by 2013, and this dials it back to your original opening comment, by 2013, they were training kids in combat sambo and MMA starting age 6 or 7. And I was like, give it 10 years. And I was telling people when I come back, in 10 years, the Russians are going to be dominating MMA.
Yeah.
And look where we are now,
Yeah.
right? Not
Uh,
just the Russians, but all the former Soviet nations and the Caucasians
yeah, I
and all
mean,
that. Yeah.
it seems actually like most of the top guys now are from that Caucasus region or the kind of outlying areas. I know from having talked to guys that have been from that region that from what they tell me, you kind of grow up fighting there. It's
Oh yeah.
that's their pastime is your street fighting as a kid, and the only recreation you have besides that is you go to the gym and you train sambo, you train wrestling, you train judo. If they
Hmm.
have karate or taekwondo, you're just always either fighting in the street or fighting in the gym for recreation. So I guess that
Absolutely.
helps.
And they all have their own national wrestling styles, which
Yeah,
everybody's doing. Like there's Kurash from Uzbekistan, which is
yeah,
essentially like Shuaijiao or any wrestling sport with a jacket where the throw wins. Like there's no grappling,
yeah,
but um well, BJJ is the
right.
outlier with that
Well,
mat grappling became like the predominant
It's
style.
interesting that Sambo is a grappling art and has its origins in judo like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does,
Hmm.
but kind of developed along a little different path than BJJ. Sambo does the standing wrestling, and they're also known on the ground for the leg locks, while BJJ used to eschew leg locks, so they do a lot of them now. But
Hmm. Hmm.
BJJ does a lot of chokes, which in pure sports Sambo aren't even allowed. So why do you think Sambo developed along those lines, and how do you compare it to BJJ?
Well, I mean, some of this is just theory, and some of this is what I've heard from my coach, my coach was born in 39, so he started training as a child too,
Hmm.
like in military academy. And
Hmm.
then in other old timers I've heard, like even David Rudman told me, he said before World War II, they did allow chokes in Sambo competition.
Hmm.
And there were like the rules were very different, just like every sport, right? The rules evolve as the sport evolves. But back then they were 10-minute matches. There was no limit on the ground time.
Hmm.
So and there was
Well,
chokes were allowed and leg locks were
yeah,
allowed.
I would imagine it was a much more brutal thing back then in that era. And
Yeah.
I know he told me and I don't know, I guess he heard this from some of the old timers, the founders of it, that the way they came up with a lot of those holds or perfected a lot of them was the KGB or whoever was in charge of the prisons over there. They would take guys in the gulag and put them in arm locks or leg locks and see what broke their limbs the best. So,
Yeah, I wonder how much of that's, I mean, I've heard those stories too,
yeah.
like I wonder how much of it is urban legend, but
It would not shock me for guys because I know that was also supposedly done by karate guys in Japan during World War II, that they would take POWs and see, if they could kill them with a punch, which they couldn't, but I'm sure the
I mean,
POWs
listen,
didn't enjoy it too much.
there's no question that militaries use their captives in very fucked up ways. I mean, we see this going on right now,
Yeah,
right? In the world. We don't have to
yeah,
go down that path, but we see it. And
yeah,
it's like, so you're POW, we're gonna do shit to you. So like I'm
yeah,
sure that there was some of that,
yeah,
but in terms of like some of the stories I've heard, like propaganda I've heard regarding
yeah.
the founding of Sambo, I honestly just think it was like more about we need to develop the most effective fighting style. Like my coach said,
Hmm.
he said, listen, you have a recruit for 3 months and you've got to give them something they can use quickly. So, so it's like very base gross motor
Yeah,
movement type stuff. You know what I mean? It's like not fancy. Like the old combat sambo stuff is not fancy. It's not like the Sistema stuff that you see or anything
yeah.
like that, but it's like it was more like what you might think of any combative system.
Hmm.
Like even army combatives, right? Guys will get their thing, but if you want to get really good, you're going to go off base and keep training. Or so I think Sambo's the same. But in terms of the sport, my coach always said the leg locks came from catch wrestling.
Hmm.
Like, and he never used the word catch wrestling. Ironically, he called it American freestyle wrestling, no relation to our actual freestyle wrestling. More of a relation to the original name of Sambo, which was freestyle wrestling. For people that don't know, when they first came up with this style, they called it freestyle wrestling back then in the 30s because they just meant it was like wrestling where you could do anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Which
Like,
is what, most Western wrestling was back before it became all show, that it
yep.
was what you're calling catch wrestling. It was basically like the UFC without striking.
And there were legitimate there was a catch wrestling circuit in Russia, and that
Hmm.
stuff people would have been exposed to that. And so I think Sambo, unlike Jiu-Jitsu, like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Sambo were obviously cousins. We have some roots in judo together,
Yeah,
right? One of the founders of Sambo, Oshchepkov, was second Dan. He was a Nidan in judo under
right,
Kano, right? He
right.
was only the fourth non-Japanese to ever get a Shodan from the Kodokan. And then so you had like that whole thing, but then you had Spiridonov who had already started. He was older than Oshchepkov, and he had already started a hand-to-hand system that existed by the time Oshchepkov came
Hmm.
back to Russia from Japan. And it was a different style, more based on like wrestling and the indigenous styles of the Soviet Union and what he could learn from books. There was Japanese jiu-jitsu influence that he learned from books. He never
Hmm.
actually trained it, but and then there's sort of also this mythology that these two guys like kind of worked together to found Sambo, which
Hmm.
was not the case. They were in fact not friends. They were competitors. Like Oshevkov came back and wanted freestyle wrestling to be the system for the military, and but Spiridonov already had his foot in the door, right? So
Didn't Chepkov end up getting
yeah, he
hauled
was
off
killed.
by the KGB?
Yep, he was killed in
Yeah.
37 in the purges, accused of being a spy, a Japanese
Yeah.
spy. And when I was in Russia, one of my trips in Russia, one of the old timers told me that it was, I don't know if this is true. This is entirely like decades ago, word of mouth, but he said it was Spiridonov who probably fingered Oshchepkov as a
I
spy.
had read that somewhere. Who
Yeah.
knows if it's true, but yeah, I guess like a lot of martial arts styles, there's always some backstabbing going on, and if you're
Yep.
in that culture where you've got a secret police, that's the
Hmm.
kind of thing that can happen. So when you compare Sambo and BJJ, it seems like BJJ does have the edge in straight grappling competitions. Maybe that's because those are closer to the normal BJJ rule set. But when it comes to MMA, it seems like, at least in recent years, the best combat Sambo guys have done much better in MMA than the best BJJ players. And again, that could be because MMA is closer to the combat Sambo rule set.
Hmm.
But why do you think we see that difference between the two arts from straight grappling to MMA?
Well, I mean, in the end, I always say it's about the individual, right?
Hmm.
But so I don't buy too much into the style versus style thing anymore.
Hmm.
That's an old way of thinking, you
Right.
know? I mean, it
Right.
was a legitimate way of thinking in the 90s, right? But
Yeah.
now, not so much. But what I will say is regarding your comment about straight grappling, I think if you go back to, let's say 15 years ago, to when there wasn't the grappling, let's just say the BJJ sort of centric grappling scene that exists today.
Hmm.
Like when I competed in the Jean LaBelle Grapplers Challenge in 2008
Hmm.
in Toronto. It wasn't like a BJJ centric thing. It was still pretty much an open field. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? You had wrestlers, judo guys, jiu-jitsu guys, sambo guys. I wasn't even a sambo guy at that time. I was just learning jiu-jitsu, grappling, whatever I could get. But it was like the whole sort of solidification of the IBJJF rule set and all that kind of stuff didn't, and popularization of grappling tournaments, jiu-jitsu based grappling tournaments, wasn't as popular as it was now. And so it was still kind of a little bit style versus style. And, I mean, listen, in 2008, that year when LaBelle had his tournament there, that was a crazy year, right? That was the first year of Abu Dhabi. That
Hmm.
was the blackout years of MMA. So people were looking for other stuff. You had the contenders on
Yeah.
pay-per-view. And none of that stuff was presented as a BJJ centric thing. It was all just grappling, right?
Hmm.
But eventually BJJ, the IBJJF and the Gracies really had the marketing strategy, and to
Yeah.
their credit, they made it the dominant style. And back then, a lot of the stuff that we were doing in Sambo was considered dirty, like you said, like leg locks and stuff
Yeah.
like
They
that.
used to boo guys at the BJJ tournaments if they do a leg
Yeah.
lock.
So, like, if you were to ask the question, like, which was the more dominant on the ground, it now I would say jujitsu, sort of. Uh, the rank and file IBJJF guys still aren't doing the leg locks well and stuff like that, but the pro guys and the active competitors
Yeah.
in are. So, like, on that level, they definitely, like mixed martial arts, have embraced takedowns and
Yeah.
wrestling and all the different things. So it's
Yeah,
like
I think in fairness, Sambo's been influenced by BJJ over the years, and BJJ has been influenced by Sambo and wrestling and other styles over
100%.
the years. So I don't know anybody is doing a pure art anymore.
No, I mean, look, I have, aside from my master of sport in Sambo, I have a Shodan in judo and I have a purple belt in BJJ. You know,
Hmm.
it's like we
Yeah.
all just cross train.
Yeah.
But to the MMA thing, I think the real difference is training, or the stylistic philosophy is what, aside, okay, you can take the technical, okay, combat sambo guys from day one are learning transitions from different ranges, right? So
Hmm.
that's super important, right? They're
Yeah.
just learning how to strike into takedowns, how to take down into submissions. And the philosophy has always been to end fights as fast as you can, right? I mean, that's hasn't changed from the old combat sambo days when it was still just like you're in a real fight, you need to end it as fast as you can. And that mentality is built into the rules, right? So when people compete in combat sambo, for example, you could outbox somebody for the entire 5 minutes of the match. If they throw you once, they're going to win,
Hmm.
right? So you don't score points for just good striking at all. You have to drop them. Like if you want points for your punches or your kicks, you have to drop them.
Right.
They score it like a throw.
Well,
So the mentality of the sport is still end the fight fast,
Well,
right?
what I find interesting is that all the Sambo guys you see having great success in the UFC, Habib Nurmagomedov, Islam
Mm-hmm.
Makhachev, Merab, Rakhmonov, Shamaev, these guys are doing it primarily on the basis of their wrestling skills. They
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
doggedly pursue takedowns, and when they get them, they ride their opponents on the ground, beat them up a little, and if they
Yep.
can get a submission, great, but they're content to just use that wrestling to take them down and control their opponents, and no one seems able to counter this right now. You don't see American wrestlers being able to successfully imitate this style. Why do you think that is?
It's a good question because, right, there was a time, right, in the development of MMA as a sport, and we're still only like sophomore,
Yeah,
we're still
yeah,
only a sophomore as a sport.
right.
But the early days, it was the jiu-jitsu guys. They had the stuff that people didn't know. Then all of a sudden the wrestlers came, Hammerhouse and all those guys, and then the wrestlers dominated
Hmm.
because they had the stuff that the other people did.
Hmm.
Then you had guys like Maurice Smith, like the first strikers who could shut down the wrestlers. Then all of a
Hmm.
sudden, like, so this whole
Yeah,
evolution keeps happening. And then you have now, I think the Sambo guys, like you said, they're really using the wrestling as their strong, like that's their queen, right?
yeah,
If just for, but they're not just taking shots, they're striking their way
right.
in. But the thing is that the strike is considered a distraction
Yeah.
more than something that, you know what I mean? So they're just really good at that
Yeah,
transition.
I agree with you. I tend to think it's a psychological thing as much as anything because you see a lot of American wrestlers start to learn striking and kind of
Hmm.
abandon their wrestling because they could become so enamored with knocking guys out. And then
Whoa, yeah. I
when
mean,
they
look at
need the
Dan Henderson.
wrestling, yeah,
He's
uh,
a
w-
perfect example. I mean, that
uh,
guy was Olympic level wrestler that
yeah.
once he discovered the H bomb, it was like he stopped wrestling.
Yeah,
You know?
and when they need it, then they're rusty on it and can't employ it as well. But the Sambo guys, for the most part, they seem to be smart enough, or their trainers are smart enough to learn just enough striking to defend themselves on the feet, but still remember what got them there and be
Mhm.
willing to stick with the game plan of wrestling, even if it can lead to a more boring fight, which I think is also part of it. American fighters
Sure.
are trying to sell themselves to the crowd a bit more by having exciting fights, whereas the Sambo guys just seem to want to win.
Well, they win and then they actually get subsidies. They get subs
Ah,
home. There's legit benefits of winning.
yeah,
When you go back home. Here you win and you go back to being broke. So it's
yeah.
like
And unless you draw the crowd in.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly. But and then to your other point about them just wrestling and not caring as much about finishing so quickly, that again is the culture of the sport. Like that's one of the big differences between jiu-jitsu and sambo and judo is the pin. And unlike judo, you cannot win with a pin in sambo. Like so
mhm,
you get points for the pin, but then you still have to finish them. You know what I mean?
mhm,
Whereas the whole position before submission mentality in jiu-jitsu is really just about getting the points. It might have
yeah,
meant back in the day, it might have meant to hold control somebody,
Yeah.
But now with the way the rules are, it's just hold your position for 3 seconds, get your points, and then move on. But in Sambo, it's like you got to hold them for 20 seconds. You want the points, it's 20 seconds. And you're
Yeah.
not going to win because so you have to hold them and then keep them in a pin, which allows you to then move on to a sub. It's not like in judo a lot of times, like where you'll see these a winning throw that ends really
Yeah.
sloppily, but they don't care
I
because they,
think the conditioning and the mental toughness too that some of the Sambo players have, like the wrestlers, I think that's an advantage
Mhm,
that some of the BJJ players don't have as much because they tend to emphasize technique over physicality, whereas the Sambo guys,
mhm.
some of those guys are just in phenomenal shape. They can just go for hours without
Oh yeah,
stopping.
for sure. And some of that is also about where they're from.
Yeah,
They're not from the most wealthy places, so
yeah.
they're coming from tough lives.
Like
So yeah,
like
I think culturally, not culturally, like ethnically, culturally, but also culturally, sport culture
mhm.
just lends itself to MMA.
Now, turning away from MMA for a moment, I know in recent years you've been involved in movie stunt work, doing fight scenes, fight choreography. How'd you get involved in that?
Well, like anybody in the film biz or the TV biz, it was kind of a winding road. But I will say that it's something I had aspired to since childhood, honestly. And I even went to summer camp for filmmaking. And then when I went to college, I went to School of Visual Arts for advertising. But the goal was always to break into film. But I never actually thought about stunts or merging my martial life and my interest in film and stuff and my art, my artistic life. I never
Mhm.
even considered it. It's like when you talk to the guidance counselor at high school, they don't tell you like, oh, there's
Yeah,
this thing called the stuntman. It's like
yeah.
but I would say that it's always been an interest. And then what kind of formally brought me into that world, not stunts per se, but television, was The Human Weapon on History Channel because
Mhm.
they found me on YouTube, like a lot of people did back then. And I worked on the Sambo episode of Human Weapon. And that sort of started the ball rolling. That was in 2007-ish, I think. And then I got another gig working for Travel Channel on Tahani Tackles the Globe. And then that one I was actually on camera. We did a whole episode. We went to Russia and trained with my coach.
Mhm.
And then I coached Dahani in some combat sambo fights. And then that was in 2009. And then my YouTube channel was growing and people were sort of seeing me as somebody who was making videos and things like that. And then by 2010, myself and Colleen Poole, we did the New York MMA documentary.
Mhm.
And that, to our surprise, got picked up and distributed on Hulu, right? And it was on Hulu until 2016. And so we got really lucky with a first feature film getting picked up and distributed. And that led to my former student, Sean Fitzgerald. So we got onto Hulu in 2013. Like, I'm just trying to figure out the timeline here. And then 2014, my student, Sean Fitzgerald, who had graduated film school, was now living in LA and he was writing a pilot for a TV show and trying to pitch a series. And it was based on the then still illegal world of mixed martial arts in New York because
Mhm.
we were the last, state to regulate it. And so he hit me up. He goes, "Hey, Mister Big Time Producer, you got a movie on Hulu. You wanna produce my short, my proof of concept?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So we raised $8,000 and we shot this thing. And Al Iaquinta, who most listeners probably would know as from the UFC, is a fighter from the UFC. I've known him since he was 16 or 17 because back then I was teaching once a week out in Long Island at the gym he was training at
Mhm.
before he was at Serra Longo. So he hit me up and he was like, "Hey man," because we were holding auditions. He's like, I'd like to throw my hat in the ring for that." And so we ended up casting him as the lead. Shot this short called Choke Artist, and because he was in it and he was talking it up at UFC press conferences and things like that, we got a deal with Fox Sports to do a full story on the show, and then we gave them exclusivity to play our short. And that got me on the radar of some bigger name people. And so Sean and I got called into Darren Aronofsky's office, his production office here in Brooklyn, because he was thinking of doing a TV series. He still hasn't done a TV series, but he was considering it, and so brought us in to talk about it. We had a couple of meetings and stuff, which was interesting. I didn't meet with Aronofsky; I met with like his people, but we didn't do the show. But I met the stunt coordinator that he works with, and his name was Doug Crosby, who many might know is a somewhat controversial MMA judge as well. But he is a stunt guy and stunt coordinator historically, professionally. And he said, Steve, you should think about stunts. The fight scene you did in the short was really great, and you've got this filmmaking. And then all of a sudden, a light bulb went off. Ding! Like, why did I never think of this? So that was 10 years ago. And so that was sort of like the my demarcation, the first time a
Right.
stunt coordinator said to me, like, yo, you should be doing this.
And you've
And
done
it's
you've done
yeah.
some pretty good movies. I mean, didn't you do one of the John Wick films?
Yeah, I worked on two and three. And
Hmm.
then actually, ironically, and this is all around the same time, like the 2014, 2015, like when John Wick 1 came out in 2013 or something. 2013, they were shooting it. Well, actually, yeah, didn't they just have their anniversary, right? It came out in 2014. They had 10 years John Wick. So uh, at that time, I wasn't quite yet thinking about stunts. It was right before I met Doug. And then Chad Stahelski and David Leach and those guys came from 8711 to my gym in New York. They said, "Hey," and I had no idea who they were. And they
Hmm.
were like, "Hey, we're shooting this little indie film called John Wick." Like nobody knew what, it was not
Yeah.
made yet. So they're like, and we're looking for Russian bad guys. And do you know anybody that we could, audition? And that's how I sent them Vlad Kulikov. So that's how Vlad got into John Wick 1.
Oh, I never knew
Yeah.
that. I know Valad very well. We used to train up at Phil Dunlap's gym.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. So if you go back and watch John Wick 1, Vlad is the guy who
yeah.
puts the bag over Wick's head and then gets sniped by Willem Dafoe, right? And then he's also in the bathhouse scene. He's one of the security guards running
Uh,
around in the bathhouse scene and stuff. So
and then you got in on the action yourself in two and three.
yeah. So what's funny is so then by 2015 they were already working on two, and then Chad's assistant called me and said, "Hey, Chad, like you to come in and are you interested in working with the team on two?" And to be honest, I didn't remember meeting Chad,
Hmm.
because like I didn't know who he was really at the time. So I go in to meet with him, and I'm like, "Hey, man, it's really great to meet you. This is awesome." He goes, "We met already. I was in your gym." I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's right. Shit." So
You
yeah, so that the whole thing with Choke Artist and John Wick kind of started around the same time and just pushed me into the biz. And
right,
so now, 10 years later, I've had a pretty decent career so
right.
far. And the gym itself has kind of been dovetailed into that world too. So we rent out our space for auditions and rehearsals, and we
And you
try and
you have
film
a
some things.
podcast devoted to movie stunt work, don't you? It's called Fights with Friends.
Yeah, so my partner in the podcast, co-host, and also he's teaches at my gym. He's been a student of mine for over 15 years, Paul Veracci. And he originally got started. He trained under my student Riley Bodycomb. So,
Mhm.
and then when Riley left New York, Paul continued to train with me. So we've known each other for a long, long time, and we're both movie nerds, and we both decided to try this stunt thing at the same time. So we've traveled this journey together, and so we started the podcast together. It's called Film Fights with Friends, and so basically the show is the kernel of the discussion is a fight scene from a TV show or a movie, and then we have somebody on the show that's connected to that scene, and that could be a performer or a director or a writer or cinematographer, even animator,
Uh,
anybody in the industry that's
right.
connected somehow. And then we talk about that fight from script to screen, and then also into the life of our guest. And and it's been great. We have 26 episodes in the can for season one. Episode 17 dropped this past Friday, so it's gone good, man.
Good.
It's been great. It's
Where
kind of
can
like,
people? I'm sorry. Go
yeah.
ahead.
No, no, I was gonna say it's kind of like show running. It's like show
Yeah.
running a
Yeah.
series. So it's yourself. It's a ton of work, research
Yeah.
and editing and finding the
Oh yeah.
guests and
Yeah.
and we're not making money. We were lucky enough to get some great sponsors, so we actually broke even on
Mhm.
season one. But
Well, yeah,
um
you'll have to send some of them my way.
listen, the
So,
way that we got our sponsors were legit just people we work with in the film
yeah.
business and said, "Hey, we're gonna try this thing. Do you want to support us?"
Where
And
can people listen to your podcast?
you can watch the video version on YouTube
Hmm.
and pretty much everywhere you listen to podcasts. We're on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, YouTube Music,
Well,
Podbean, you name it. We're everywhere.
put some links down there to it. And for people who want to find out more about you and Sambo, if they're interested in it, where can they go?
Probably you can find me on Instagram at Sambo Steve. You
Hmm.
can find me everywhere as Sambo Steve. It's that hasn't changed since the underground days, So you can, if you go on Reddit, you'll find Sambo Steve. If you go on Instagram, you'll find Sambo Steve. Facebook, you can find New York Combat Sambo, and you can also find Film Fights with Friends. And yeah, man, uh,
Okay.
Film Fights Friends Pod on Instagram and TikTok.
I will post some links to that down in the show notes. I want to thank you for coming on the show, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Dude, it's been great. We've known each other for
Yeah.
forever, and
Yeah.
it was a really cool conversation.
It was. Thank you again. I appreciate Steve coming on the show. You can find some links for him down below, as well as links to the website of Eleanor Academia, who provides the music for the show, and to my own website. Until next time, as an old sensei of mine used to say, keep punching.